This is a Maplesoft digital education podcast.
Hello, Dr. Furino. Thank you for coming in again.
A pleasure.
Pleasure to talk to you. As you know, Maplesoft is in the process of spinning off a digital education company that is going to focus on digital courseware and digital assessment. Working again still very closely with the University of Waterloo, so we're very interested in talking to you about what you think of this change that we're working throughout 2018. So maybe, but as a way to start, maybe can you give a quick background of
Sure, happy to do that. I won't start with the digital era because when I was an undergraduate student, I took correspondence courses where they actually shipped us books and course notes and we wrote things out and mailed them back, and I became a better chess player by taking a correspondence chess course. So I think as an individual I was predisposed to separate learning from a strictly classroom environment. Clearly one needed good material, one needed a mentor, but one didn't need a physical space.
Mm-hmm.
Since then...
I would say, just to interrupt you, that's probably a smaller portion of the population who can operate in that environment. It does take a degree of willpower and
I think that's true.
tenacity.
I think the number of people who can individually learn, especially technical material, not a large fraction of the population. But for chess players, we were pretty enthusiastic about it. There was a period when I think, for example, of Apple's HyperCard. When I think of Apple's HyperCard stacks, where I took a look at some of those. But my real entry into digital assets began in 2010. I authored a course on the history of mathematics for the Masters of Mathematics for Teachers. Mm-hmm. The MMT, our affectionate name for the Masters of Mathematics for Teachers, is an online-only graduate program for currently practicing teachers of mathematics. It's been a fantastic success. And since then, I've authored another course. I've been a teacher, an administrator, a champion, a funder, so lots of roles. And in that interim, in that period between 2010 and 2017, I was also Associate Dean, which gives one an intimate look at how the undergraduate side of the operation works and how online courses and digital assets play into the lives of students. And I'm now Assistant Dean Online.
Now, for you, at U of W in the math department, if 100% would be a full usage of digital data or digital assets in your all courses being offered, where are you now? What percentage are you currently providing compared to what you think you'll end up providing when you're done, if there is a done?
So first question would be a definitional question. Yeah. What constitutes a digital asset? So for example, would a PDF or slides constitute?
A good question, but I would say that it's a percentage of where you see the university or the department getting to, we'll say, in the next 5 years. So I would say yes, but it wouldn't be it would only be a small fraction of where you would see yourself in 5 years.
So in the Faculty of Mathematics, we're probably close to 100% are providing some form of digital assets in the form of PDF course notes or slides of various kinds. Purpose-built digital assets that would include exposition, assessment, experimentation, we're probably about 15% of the way there. Okay. And I would guess that within 5 years we'll be 50% of the way there.
Yeah. Okay. That's very good. Have you been able to take advantage of any of the analytics that you can obtain from the use of these assets?
This is a complicated question.
Yeah.
So in our learning management system, it's actually hard to extract data. With Mobius, we're able to get some data. We have seen, based on a preliminary look at a large class for Calculus 1 for science students, enrollment about 1,000 students. This past fall was the best results in the preceding 15 years. Now, it's hard to say scientifically, or statistically, that the results are solely the result of, that the improved results are solely the consequence of
If you hold
moving
everything
to
else
Mobius.
equal, but you never hold everything
We'd never
else
hold
equal.
everything else equal.
Yeah.
So at the very least, I think we could say no damage was done. We are right now, actually, as we speak this week, going to be comparing the use of Mobius versus the performance by individual students, and we'll get a much better handle of what subset of students performed well or badly, and that correlation to their usage of Mobius.
Okay. Does that include a student survey of how they enjoyed working in that environment, or?
It does not for this pass because we don't yet have approval to do that.
I see. Okay. Yes, it is a constrained environment, is it not? In the future, of course, hopefully, you would be able to compare, we'll say, digital to digital. Like you'll have equal, more of a level playing ground, or a level playing field in how you're bringing in the data. So it should make it, I would think, easier to compare this year to next year to the year after.
That's certainly our hope. We're planning to do longitudinal studies of individual students and cohorts of students and of the assets themselves. But we do need a steady data stream for that and time.
Now, do you see yourself sharing that data stream? I mean, do you see this as being all within the ring road of the University of Waterloo, or would you see yourself working with other institutions to maybe share data and analyze that data?
So I think there's a huge gain to be had by looking at this as a research project like all other research projects, making sure that the data is available for other people to test our findings and to test their own work against. And so I would expect a much larger sharing of the data, suitably anonymized.
Yeah, I think that's definitely has to be.
Right. But I would foresee that we're actually at the beginning of a pretty intensive, say 10 to 15 years of research into how the digital assets work, what the best fit of students and environments is to those assets. The other thing I think it's important to do is actually have controlled experiments of the assets themselves. Because it's not simply that students may do better or less well, but some of the assets may be better suited to the task than other assets, or we may not be working with or against known cognitive biases. So we're also planning on doing some controlled experiments over the next 3 years.
Oh, that's interesting. I've always felt that you can look at this type of data with two lenses. One, you can look at it from the user point of view, the student point of view, or the cohort moving through the material. But you can also look at it from in a very content-centric point of view. So you're looking at the content and it just has anonymous users, and is it functioning well? Is it doing what you're expecting it to do?
So I'm thinking that we'll have 3 areas: content, exactly as you mentioned, the cohorts of students, but also the structure of the content, as opposed to this specific piece of content, but do we make best use of the testing effect? That is, it's well known that if we ask students a question, they answer the question, and we assess the answer, memory retention is much better.
Yes.
Does that work in Mobius, and B, in our specific implementation of Mobius? The Dunning-Kruger effect, where people who do not know what they're talking about do not know that they do not know what they're talking about.
And they tend to be the most assertive in knowing what they do not know.
Right, and so being able to ask questions in a low-stakes environment might alert students to, oh, I really don't know this.
Yeah.
And informally, we know this happens because the number of times students go to a teacher of mathematics and say, I really know this, I just can't do this question. So we know that they don't necessarily know what they don't know. So part of the effort in the control test was to make sure that Mobius is reinforcing what we want reinforced in cognitive biases and mitigating the
Yes.
negative effects.
Like, yeah, one is more of a system of how you're using the various pieces together. I think, like I've always felt we're right on the edge. Like we have lots of data just coming online from the usage of digital assets within the education process. It's now the next challenge will be how to best use that data, like how to interpret it, how to change the measurement. I believe that that's going to be the big change. 5 years from now, if we're looking back, that this could be the start of truly education measured. I mean, there's many other advantages having digital content. You can have better graphics, you can have 3D graphics, you can have animations, you can have lots of interactivity, all good things. But I do feel the key difference, if we were 5 years in the future looking backwards, would be this measurement and how we use that measured data.
So I think this is actually going to be a hard problem to solve, because it's not clear to me what the best measurement is of someone learning. And we've been looking at learning for a long time in a serious way, a couple of thousand years. So it's not clear to me what we should be measuring, how we measure it, what biases we bring to that measurement, how we identify those biases and strip them out. Algorithms almost always encode the cultural reference of the people writing the algorithms. If assets created by the University of Waterloo for mathematics are used in widely different cultures, have we made misjudgments about the underlying metrics because there's a cultural difference, or the behavior that's expected of a student, or the use of the assets?
I agree with you that you'll probably never have an absolute answer. Like the answer will never just be 42, and that's the best answer. But I do think you can use the data to sort of move up the response curve. Like I think you'll be able to differentiate between not as good and better. And like there's lots of items that would be indicators of that, like right answers, comprehension, engagement rate, are people actually interacting with the materials? So there's lots of data, and I agree, you can't just go into the student's brain and say, okay, the comprehension switch is now checked. But I do think it won't be, or maybe the way I'm interpreting what you're saying is I agree that there would not be an absolute answer, but I do think it'll be very, I almost said the word easy. I don't think easy is the right word. It'll be possible to know if this is better than it used to be. So like you'll know if you're moving in the right direction.
So a couple of things. Our assumption is that that's part of our research project, is to make it better. But I think it might be harder than we anticipate. We won't really know at the University of Waterloo until we get well underway with lots of data. And that effort in a serious way begins this year, so we're still several years away.
Well, and I would agree with that. In fact, the big question in my mind, it's really big data. I mean, if you look at the number of touch points you have as a student moves through the materials, time spent, how long they've interacted, whether they've watched everything, success rates, so it's lots of data for every student, as for every seconds and minutes that they're spending with the material. It's almost too much data for a human to comprehend. So I do see that we're going to have to take steps to process that data in such a way.
Absolutely.
And I love the concept of, and I agree, this is a number of years out, that there's an AI type tutor that can bring adaptability to a real level. Today, adaptive courses tend to be, well, if you get it wrong, you get an easy next question. If you get it right, you get a harder one. It'd be wonderful if you could actually, for example, segment what you just said about groups of students from different countries, different cultural backgrounds, and it could automatically, adjust the materials to adapt to a bias that they might have. Like that would be true adaptability. And I don't know if a human I think it will have to be something that processes a large amount of data that would probably be outside of a human's ability to do that.
Well, so this is something I don't know enough about, is how we're going to build this artificially intelligent agent. When I think of Star Trek movies, I don't know if you remember the scene where Spock is in his little learning pod, and the young Spock is in his little learning pod. We're going to head down that way, in part because of individual accommodation that will be available to students, in part because it will be seen to be less expensive. It's not clear to me that it is actually going to be less expensive. But it may, in the end, be more effective. But at the very least, I think we need to test out the hypothesis. And that means accumulating the data, running some experiments, building the AI agents, and hopefully we'll have more to say about that in 5 years' time when we sit in these chairs again, or somebody else's chairs.
And I agree that I think it's all about, I think cost is one side of the coin of effectiveness. If you're more effective in theory, you're learning more in less time. But cost shouldn't be the only measure. I do think the one thing that is very different with using digital assets in the teaching process, and maybe this is my background as a control engineer, is the speed of the feedback cycle. That excites me, as opposed to testing a week later when that, well, it has two effects actually. One, you can provide students with instant feedback. So if it's 2 in the morning and they're working on something, you can actually give them instant feedback. They don't have to wait a period of time that makes it less effective. But just as important, I see that the digital content, if used correctly, as opposed to having like a 5-year update cycle in a printed text, you can use the analytics, the data that you're gathering, how it's used. Potentially you can automatically flag someone that there's a problem in some area, and it can be corrected, or a different approach can be tried in real time, and then to see if it works better or not. I think that is much closer.
So that, I think, we'll be at pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So several thoughts about that, because I'm the guy who actually has to schedule these things and write the checks for them. So first, we need a data stream underneath that can capture enough for us to realistically make those kinds of judgments.
Yeah.
Once an assessment is made that, well, I'll back up. So some of it can be correcting typos. Very few books get through the process without some typos. And if the assets are digital, we can do that in close to real time. But
no typos. That would make education much less interesting, I think. I think we should put more typos in.
Well, with thinking of cognitive effects, that might not be that might not be wrong. So one is, do we have a data stream? Do we have analytics that will support identification of things that need improving? And then there's the problem of actually who undertakes the effort to correct what's in the digital assets, improve whatever that definition of improve would mean, or try a different approach. All of that takes time.
Yeah.
And the typical cycle for an academic doesn't allow for that sort of continuous real-time improvement or near real-time improvement. So we also need to change workflow. And as you know, universities are fairly conservative beasts. And so some care needs to be given to improving workflow or altering workflow to recognize the fact that
definitely wouldn't want to suggest that there are not issues in the structure that need to be overcome. But I do think at least, let's say that there is a focus on improving education, improving student outcomes, for whatever reason. At least it gives you the ability of operating in real time, like gathering analytics on how students did, on Tuesday and fixing it by Wednesday, so that the next, class that uses that material is different and potentially better, and maybe can be measured better. So it at least provides the potential to do that. I agree that the incentives have to be in place so that that's what you want to do.
So I think there's lots of goodwill and lots of keen interest on the part of teachers. I think the real issue is the actual mechanics of doing this in the workflow of people who have very busy lives.
Yeah.
If we look in the future and say we have an artificially intelligent agent, that agent might recognize certain kinds of straightforward errors and correct typos. But I think often you're going to need the judgment of an experienced human teacher.
Oh yeah,
to say,
I fully agree.
This is the route we need to go, and those experienced human teachers will have lots of demands on their time.
Yeah, so no, I fully agree with that. That's why I think it's not there was a time, hopefully it's gone, but I think educators were afraid that systems would replace what they do.
I'd say that fear is still there, and it doesn't help us that there's lots of public discourse, in part by politicians and funders of education, that if we had the right set of digital assets, all of the humans at the front of the classroom would not be needed.
Yeah, it's just a silly concept, right? We're social animals, and one of the reasons we learn is that human-to-human feedback loop. Most, machine learning concepts where there was some computerized voice says, "Well done," like it's laughable, right? So I can't. It's hard for me to take that concept seriously. I see that without that human feedback loop. I mean, I do agree. I think that the tools can allow a gifted educator to be much more effective over a much larger number of students. But unless you have someone that cares enough to constantly improve, then this whole thing, I think, falls apart. It doesn't work.
This is actually one of the biggest questions for me looking out into the near-term future, is how is it that human teachers will make the most effective use of digital assets? So what is it as part of their relationship with the student where they can get the biggest bang for their time? So when I think of routine exercises that we all want students to do, speaking as a mathematician,
drill and practice, it's a
particularly
good thing.
Want them to work through questions, as many as possible. But if I'm the human teacher and I have to mark the 120 sets of exercises daily, I'm just not going to assign daily exercises.
So automatic marking is a must-have.
So that's the kind of thing that can spare me a lot of time. It can identify sets of students for whom enrichment material should be provided and sets of students who need more attention, and maybe even what kind of attention they need. Can we diagnose a particular failure in background, or that students take a standard fixed approach when a little more creativity is needed? But I think we will need to do a lot of experimenting to figure out how it is that humans as teachers, humans as students, and content and systems interact to make learning more effective.
I fully agree, but I do think there's low-hanging fruit that, like, as an example, you provide you teach an example, or you teach a concept, you test on that concept. If you don't get a high percentage of the class understanding that concept, then something is wrong. So I agree, the human instructor then would try something else, and does he get a higher percentage of understanding or a lower percentage? I see that as the low-hanging fruit of improvement.
For me, the low-hanging fruit is just knowing what it is that students know and getting some sense of how strongly students believe they know the content correctly. So I have this very embarrassing example, which I might have mentioned before. So I used clickers in a class that I'd taught for more than 20 years. And clicker is a small device that allows you to select a multiple choice answer. And this was a course on learning how to prove. I gave a very simple definition, some examples, and then put up a clicker question. And I had expected the distribution to have A, essentially none, B, essentially none, C, the correct answer to be almost everybody, D, essentially none. But it was flat. It was a uniform distribution.
Random noise.
So it meant for 20 years I had been assuming that students knew this, and they didn't. And that, of course, affected everything from that moment on. It meant that I'd made an erroneous judgment.
And what did you do then?
So it was interesting because that kind of interruption is the kind of interruption we can have when we have the digital assets identify a similar problem. In class, the simplest thing to do was back up, do some more examples, and try, by question and answer with the students, figure out where the misunderstanding was. And that only took 5 or 10 minutes, and a subsequent clicker question had the desired distribution. But the low-hanging fruit for me is just understanding where students are.
Oh, yeah,
and that's tremendously powerful right there.
I think that's what we're saying, the same thing. I mean, you have to first understand where they are, their level of, we'll say, comprehension across the class. You still have to do something about it. So I think we're saying the same thing.
Right. I guess all that I would emphasize is for many of us, we don't even think about a relatively straightforward or easy mechanism to extract that information about what is it that students know at this point in time.
Yeah.
And once we know that, then we can make suitable adjustments.
Yes, I agree. No, it's exciting actually that you're actually you're rolling out courses now, and I think it will only become better, and you'll have comparative studies between calculus for science and calculus for engineers, and
just calculus for science over time. No, I'm pretty excited.
You're right, the same course over time, and in theory it gets better.
And presumably at some point, well, yes, in theory it gets better until there's presumably some point where it levels off, but I'm operating without data.
Yeah.
And so I hope to learn a lot in the next few years.